So we're delighted to have Joe Walton with us, who is one of our research fellows and does a lot of work around generative text and poetry, sci-fi. He's done a lot of amazing work around digital humanities and climate change. And so we're delighted that Joe is able to do a session with us on higher education and ChatGPT, which is, from all accounts, very popular at the moment.
It's very popular at the moment.
Yeah, so a very timely event.
And also very unpopular.
Yes, exactly. So a timely event, and I'll hand over to Joe.
Thank you. So yeah, as Sharon said, this is the Sussex Humanities Lab, and we'd like to have conversations here, and we thought that one of the conversations we should be having is about ChatGPT, partly because that conversation is happening everywhere, and it will be really interesting to hear what you've heard, and to kind of bring together some perspectives. ChatGPT, it's an AI chatbot developed by OpenAI, kind of functioning at the moment a little bit like an arm of Microsoft. It's less than 6 months old, very cute, and it builds on OpenAI's GPT 3.5 and GPT-4 large language models, which are, without getting into the computer science, because the computer scientist David sends his apologies and couldn't make it, without getting in too deep, it's the kind of thing that we're probably fairly familiar with in terms of nobody knows how to code a computer program that will answer any query that you give it. But what we do know is how to code a computer program to more or less train itself if shown a vast corpus of textual examples. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about large language models. Recently, Google has launched its competitor, Bard. This text generation ChatGPT participates in a really long history of text generators. This is one of my personal favorites. It's a 19th century Latin poetry machine. Barbarian bridals at home promise evil covenants. Well done, 19th century. And it also participates in a current ecology of many, many other generative AI tools. Jenny.ai is one worth mentioning, partly because it has inbuilt kind of referencing functionality, so you can actually drop citations in, whereas ChatGPT at the moment, it makes up imaginary books, which is giving librarians a lot of fun dealing with requests for books that don't exist from students. But that said, ChatGPT is a huge leap. It really is. If you've seen it, and I expect most of you have, it's incredibly impressive. And just to give you a little taste, in case you haven't had a chance to play around with it, hi ChatGPT, can you offer some strategies for academics redesigning our assessments? And ChatGPT suggests, on this particular role, it suggests focusing on higher order thinking skills, using alternative assessment methods, considering using alternative assessment methods such as project-based learning, requiring students to demonstrate their knowledge in a way that can't easily be replicated by AI, emphasizing collaboration, incorporating creativity, and so on. And you see that regenerate response there. It's something I kind of want to emphasize, that if you clicked it again, it would come up with something else. Now, can you give that answer in the form of a country music song? Well, the times they are a-changing, that's for sure. With AI on the rise, we've got to find a cure. So let me tell you some strategies, if you know what I mean. So ChatGPT is a huge topic. It gives us loads that we could talk about. We could talk about the climate impacts. We could talk about the epistemology of the public sphere as not just text, but images and audiovisual content becomes easier and easier to replicate. To have some focus, this particular session is about higher education. It's about assessment in particular. It is kind of open, so there are some people, I think, probably on the Zoom who are not from Sussex, but there will be some kind of emphasis on Sussex in particular.
See that side, we can't see the bottom.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, the bottom left is the best bit.
Yeah.
How is that better? Fantastic. And there will be a little bit of emphasis on media, arts, and humanities. And I think that's partly because in the conversations that I've seen so far, maybe media, arts, and humanities hasn't been speaking as loudly as we could have. Maybe there are some kind of quite natural reasons why we're late to the ChatGPT party, but language is part of what we study. It's not just the medium in which we do instruction, it's often what we're talking about. So for example, you often hear in these conversations questions about whether the words belong to the student or the AI. Well, media arts and humanities is already thinking critically about what it might mean to treat language as a tool, or treat language as property, and what it means for language to belong even to its speaker. So I mentioned Bart and Spivak, for example, up there. Okay, so we'll look at some approaches to assessment in more detail later, and I think there's some expertise in the room that goes far beyond anything that I can offer. So I'll be giving prompts to try and draw you out into those conversations. But just to kind of get us started, to get us warmed up, here are some ideas about what assessment might look like that we can think about whether these are futures that we're interested in. Essays via Turnitin don't change much. So Turnitin is going to be launching an AI detector, I think on the 12th of April. Yeah?
They pulled back.
They pulled back, have they?
Yes.
So tell us about that.
Basically, our head of learning technology here was going to various meetings with Turnitin because it was being forced onto universities to do tests. We weren't telling anybody how it worked, and they didn't know whether it worked. And at the last minute, they've said we're not launching it yet. Doesn't mean it won't launch in a few weeks' time. Once they've sort of patted some.
Okay, fantastic.
Splattered a few rats. I don't think that's a technical term.
Splattered a few rats.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. But yes, so it may or may not launch soon, but it's not. We don't have a date that we did.
And am I right in thinking that there was a bit of uproar because you weren't able to switch it off?
Yeah, you weren't able to switch it off. It was being forced onto institutions who would then be told they had to pay for it after a certain amount of time. Students couldn't see the output as well, and also, so that's unlike an originality score that you can share that with students. So that would lead to uncertainty for students, and without knowing how it works, that's uncertainty for staff on how to use it as well. So.
And I guess there's been a lot of work around just the plagiarism detection tool to encourage us to kind of use it in a qualitative way and not just fixate on the score. Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Thanks for the updates. More updates from you in a moment, I think. Another example, a closed book exam, handwritten or typed without internet connections. So I think this is like a useful baseline to bear in mind. It might feel kind of reactionary or a step in the wrong direction, but it provides a useful baseline. And if the kind of costs and challenges of some of the new forms of assessment that are being suggested outweigh this, then it's something that we should consider using more. OpenAI book exam. So this is almost the polar opposite, but still within an exam format. Use whatever you like. Knowing what's out there and knowing how to use it is kind of part of the skill that's being assessed. A portfolio of small assignments that's built in a kind of maybe scaffolded way over the course of a module. A lot of creativity and reflexivity, action research, authenticity, things that are kind of maybe difficult to acquire AI assistance with, very embodied kind of aspect to that portfolio as well. A dialogue, I'm interested in this one. So students submit dialogues with ChatGPT and they marked on their prompts rather than on ChatGPT's outputs. AI-assisted essay and process. In other words, you aim for something like the traditional essay, but what you're looking at as the designer of the assessment and as the marker is really the process leading up to that product. So the use of AI is encouraged and taught, and the process itself is carefully documented and graded. AI marking. Students are free to use AI or not. If the submissions cross a threshold, I didn't finish that slide, are shunted off to ChatGPT. Why didn't you finish that slide for me? Are shunted off to an AI marker. So students have a choice about how they want to engage with AI. But if they use AI, then they will also be assessed by AI. That might be an option. Games. Students play a game. The high score is their mark. We might think about what kind of games we could develop for that. So there's this rapidly growing literature on AI in higher education. I'll share these slides around afterwards, perhaps enhanced, because there's another great big ChatGPT drop happening quite soon. So perhaps we can add some more links to resources. But that's a Zotero group that has some of the literature in there. And there was also a really useful session last Thursday, and there's a recording available of that, which I'd encourage people to look at. So these are some sample policy approaches, and I've said approaches because there seem to be few institutions that are saying, we have a policy and we've figured it out. Bournemouth is admirably clear. Simply speaking, do not, in bold, submit an assessment where artificial intelligence software contributed to the development of all or part of your assessment. Skipping forward a little bit, the University of Portsmouth has maybe the other kind of end of the spectrum. Use AI as a tool to assist and inform in your initial research, generation of ideas, planning and output development, but not as a replacement for your critical thinking and analysis. And the key thing here is that you have to cite and reference any text or output generated by AI for your assignment. And I think it's, I don't know, funny or interesting, or I don't know if it's instructive, but this text is also word for word the text from Deakin University in Australia, who I think developed this. And Portsmouth, I believe, have probably drawn on Deakin and maybe done some wider consultation as well, and perhaps drawn on other examples. But this particular bit, I think, began with Deakin. And then there's this one. So this is Sussex University, and this is what I've been able to find so far. So the AI generated text or responses would be treated as personation, in other words, a form of academic misconduct, unless it is explicitly allowed as part of the module assessment. And I've encountered some kind of draft guidance that's been sent around, but the person who has the more up-to-date view is Sam. And can you tell us a little bit about what's happening in Sussex?
I'm not sure I've seen that, because I can't read it.
That came from Pam.
So there might be some things in development.
Maybe I should move it away though, because I think that's.
So if you go back up to that sort of personation,
Yeah.
so as far as I'm aware, in terms of policy that has been gone through all the steps, this was a change made in January, which expanded the definition of personation from work that's submitted that another person has done for you. So yeah, friend or a essay mill or whatever you want, to expand that to include AI. And that is the bit in the brackets that I think is really important, that says, unless explicitly permitted in the assessment guidance from the module convener, because I think that leaves it open to flexible, for module conveners to be flexible in their use of ChatGPT and to sort of implement many of the examples that you've just given previously as well. So I think that's important. So the policy at Sussex is really that we're not saying ban it, because we recognise that that's, you know, Pandora's box is open, it's out there, and it would be an arms race that we couldn't win. And also, really importantly, we were just chatting as well about sort of being able to use a tool like ChatGPT as something students are going to be asked to do in the workplace. Whether it's a really useful tool, it's time saving, so gets rid of the busy work to let you get on with the really interesting thinking, hopefully. So they said that about the internet. So, yeah, but students are also really concerned about this as well, and they want to be reassured that that you know, having conversations about using this tool effectively is going to be really important, but also that they're going to get skills that are going to help them use it and also do something more than an AI, basically.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And a lot of those points I want to pick up on later in the session. But do you also want to just briefly tell us about, there's some guidance that's going to be?
Yes. So hello. Sorry, I'm going to introduce myself. Sam Hempsey. So I am from the educational enhancement team, which up until a year ago would have been called technology enhanced learning. So to put this into context, and I'm in the academic development team, and across our team and across the various teams across the university, we've been working on this, and we've got some guidance pages going onto the educational enhancement website as of tomorrow. So I'll be able to follow up in this session circulate those. And that's just sort of some general overview of what is ChatGPT, but also focusing on how it might be used in teaching and assessment. So covering the basics of personation sheeting, this university's approach, and then links to a Padlet with loads of resources, because there's so many universities and organisations that are starting to collate lots of really brilliant examples of teaching and assessing with ChatGPT, or adapting to it in terms of assessment, that we're just trying to bring all those networks together in one place for Sussex staff. But if there's a Padlet as well, which is, please add resources as you find them as well, because everyone's talking about it all over the world at the same time.
And I want to pick up on the two vivid metaphors that you mentioned. So one of them was Pandora's box,
yes.
And it's out, which is something that I agree with, but I also want to challenge a little bit, because some of the discourse around generative AI feeds into a kind of teleological idea of technology as progress that we all kind of have to cope with and accommodate. And I think my one key take home from this workshop should be that we can adopt our own framings, and as academics we have all kinds of critical resources to draw on, to sometimes push back on perhaps not closing Pandora's box altogether, but maybe putting things in for a little bit, or it's a funny metaphor, or if they're kind of swirling around the room, then like creating our own little boxes that they can't get into to do interesting things in, for example, opening different boxes to counteract Pandora's boxes. And that's the second metaphor, is the arms race, which is something that I think I really fully agree on. And there's some slides on that later, but maybe they're not even necessary. The detection approach just doesn't feel it doesn't feel like it's going to solve everything. Maybe it could be integrated into a larger strategy, but the idea that if you just kind of go out and go on YouTube and Google the detection tools, one of the first things that will come up are strategies for circumventing them, and tutorials to do that. So
and also you're submitting students' work potentially to an external and regulated space, and you're feeding another AI. So it's
okay, so I mentioned there that we have various kind of critical resources across many disciplines that we can draw on in thinking about these developments. And there is this burgeoning literature around ChatGPT and higher education, and I'm very, very grateful to the work that has been done there, but of course it is work that's been done rapidly, and some of the stuff has kind of been rushed through, and it's generally framed as kind of exploratory and provisional in various ways. So I think maybe we're getting to the point that we can start to have slightly more sophisticated conversations, that we can take a moment to pause and look at reflect on some of the assumptions that might have been embedded in those early responses. So for example, this is just one paper, not to pick on it in particular, but it says large language models can assist in the research and writing task, as well as in the development of critical thinking and problem solving skills, etc. And I'm just interested in why this is can and not might. There seems to be a lack of provisionality and speculation in this particular framing. And in fact, it's a framing that just feels very familiar, because it feels like this is how the tech companies themselves talk about this AI. Some of these claims are plausible, but they also couldn't possibly be evidenced yet. We simply don't know what the effect on students' research skills is going to be using these. You could do an empirical study, or you could draw on lived experience, but we don't even have the kind of lived experience. It is all new ground, and we need to recognize that. And then towards the end there, we're talking about large language models can also assist in the development of research skills by providing students with information and resources. Again, maybe it's plausible, but the exact opposite is also plausible, that this could be a tool that de-skills students, that replaces the process of acquiring those skills. Something like this, it feels like it's heading in the right direction. It is possible that it could support facilitation of a flow state. Flow is a theoretical construct from positive psychology, etc., etc. A student in a flow state might feel that time passes quickly with little effort, the act of writing may be enjoyable. So at least it's framed as a hypothesis, and at least there's a concrete mechanism proposed that we can talk about. We might not agree that this is happening, but there's something to explore, and there's some actual focus on the psychology of learning as well. I'll skip there a little bit. If we're approaching technology critically, here are just a few kind of angles on that. Appropriate technology, open culture, convivial technology, tools for conviviality, epistemological Luddism. So we know the Luddites broke things, but they weren't anti-technology. And epistemological Luddism is the idea that sometimes we might need to break things or withdraw from them for epistemological reasons. While we are embedded and enmeshed in these systems, it can be difficult to know them well. So sometimes we might want to pause, step back, or perhaps break things. Critical data studies, 76 reasonable questions to ask about any technology, decarbonisation and climate justice, post-humanism and technofeminism. And we won't look at all of those, but we will focus on 76 reasonable questions to ask about any technology. And we won't ask all 76 questions, but this is Stephanie Mills, I think. Yeah, Stephanie Mills comes up with a really long list of things that are perfectly reasonable to ask about something that is presented as kind of inevitable, inexorable, and something that you need to just cope with, adapt or die. And what I would like to do is ask you to spend a few minutes, perhaps maybe in kind of two groups, if we could kind of divide this room down the middle, and have a little think about questions. So what sorts of framings and questions should we be asking about ChatGPT and higher education, and especially assessment? And for people in the Zoom, perhaps this is something that you could do in the chat.
Or could do a breakout room.
Or a breakout room? Yeah, why not? Let's do a breakout room.
Do people feel okay about a breakout room?
But it will be really, really quick. So things we'll meet back in just 3 or 4 minutes, really.
3 breakout rooms, maybe, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So what do you think? And do you know what? I can refine that a little bit if you like. Interested that Portsmouth's approach is to say that it's useful in the early stages of writing to get ideas, and then you're supposed to edit it yourself. In some ways that reflects actually copyright law around joint authorship. But I think in reality, a lot more people would be using it the way that you were describing, that they might use it quite late on in the process to smooth things out and to improve the kind of the style of the expression. So there are a few kind of issues, I think, with a lot of this discourse around how we should approach assessment and AI, and I'm going to pick on a few of them, and each one of them is related to one of these kind of suggested futures of assessment. So one of them is assuming that we can incorporate AI on our own terms, and some of us here today have suggested that, right? So for example, students submit dialogues with ChatGPT and then they're marked on their prompts. And of course, we can also use ChatGPT to generate those questions, to generate those prompts themselves. So this is actually Bard, but you know, I ask Bard to write a paragraph about a novel, and then I ask Bard what I should ask Bard in order to improve it, right? So it's quite gameable. Another issue is overemphasizing the state of the art. I think we've maybe touched on this a bit already. So building assessment around the limitations of current AI. But I think also building assessment and learning around the capabilities of AI. And there's some quite dodgy vagueness around what it would actually mean to teach prompt engineering. To, I think, Alice, some of this stuff you were getting at in terms of teaching students what it means to use these tools. I think, you know, it's obviously something that we need to explore, but there is a difference between teaching principles of prompt engineering, a discipline which does not exist yet, and teaching students how to use this particular AI at this particular point in time. Over the summer, I got very, very good at Midjourney. I was an expert in prompt engineering in the art AI generator Midjourney. That knowledge is useless now.
Are we expecting a ChatGPT 5, 6, 7, 8? I mean, isn't that
Yes.
the issue?
Yeah, absolutely. So underemphasizing the role of randomness, and this is ChatGPT it uses statistical methods to detect kind of patterns between how words are embedded in vast corpora, and it uses a certain element of randomness when it generates a text. And that's something that we don't seem to be acknowledging in these conversations. You often see people say things like, oh, I asked ChatGPT this, and this is what it says when you ask it this. Or I compared ChatGPT's answer to Bard's answer. So if you're doing that properly, you need to run it 100 times or 1,000 times. I don't know. A computer scientist might be able to tell you. So understanding these as probabilistic systems and understanding how that might be relevant. So one place that might be relevant is that students could just get lucky. One output from ChatGPT might be better than another. And that might be something we need to reflect in how we approach assessment.
Can I add something
Yes.
just about that?
Yeah.
Just about like the things I'm seeing online about this is that when it doesn't know something, it makes it up, right? So you do like people, what I've seen are the sort of
Right.
the narcissists putting in the like, write a biography of me, you know, and then the famous the famous people, it's
The
fine,
narcissists.
it gets it right, and then other people, it absolutely makes things up.
Yeah.
And that is something that will happen with our students, right? Like that will be one way we might be able to.
Well, I think that's a great example, because it's not that if it knows it will, if it doesn't know it, it will make it up.
Mhm.
It's always making it up
Right.
with certain probabilities in there,
Mhm.
and some of the time it gets it right.
Can I just say, being a narcissist, I did. And it attributed to me perhaps his landmark piece of work, and it was a complete invention.
Right, this is.
And I thought, oh, I must look that up. I forgot I'd written it.
Yeah.
I think it's a really important thing, because it doesn't, we use this terrible language of like, no, what does it know? It doesn't know anything. There's a statistical model of the surface structures of language. There's no knowledge. It doesn't even have as much knowledge as like 1980s expert knowledge systems, right? There's not a database of knowledge. No?
I'm not sure about that, but yeah, maybe. Yeah.
But
It doesn't. It's not intelligible if it. Yeah. Sorry.
But will it create quote unquote knowledge? You know, somebody submits something with something made up in it. I don't realize it's made up. It gets passed as an MA thesis. It goes in the library.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that that my writing process sometimes is very also kind of random and moving bits of text around until maybe something starts to make sense. So yeah, there's an interesting philosophical question there. I think Alice makes a really, really good point about this endless personification, this endless temptation to kind of see a mind and knowledge there. And I think that's also a really good point about the fact that there isn't a knower there doesn't mean that it's not knowledge. So sometimes you hear that it's not creative, and that's nonsense, because language is creative when you move it around in structured ways. New meanings do emerge. This was the first ever country and western song about AI and assessment, right? And that was an original text.
But in terms of the practical thing, like I suppose one thing we could do for the upcoming weeks, for those of us who are worried about, who have heavily essay-based, dissertation-based things, is to remind the students that it won't get it right. I guess it's
Yeah.
it's
The danger of it, the danger of it getting it wrong.
and actually in a funny and light way.
Yeah.
Because then you're not saying like you guys will go down. You know, what you're saying is actually it's taking pot shots.
That is, I mean, I don't recommend this because I don't know, but that is the approach that I've taken. I've said
Okay.
it's in my module, it's not academic misconduct, but it doesn't do the things that I'm asking you to do.
Yeah.
I may have exaggerated the extent to which it doesn't do the things I'm asking them to do.
One of the things it doesn't enable you to do at the moment, which is, if you like, a detector tool, is when I've played with it, it won't go beyond, it has nothing beyond 2021.
Yeah.
That's
So-
changed,
Yeah.
that's
Has it?
changing, I'm afraid.
Okay,
Well,
because at
is
the
that-
moment,
yeah.
there's nothing in that bibliography
It
beyond
says it on the
2021.
first page,
Sorry?
whatever it's referencing, it tells you on the first page.
Yeah.
Yeah, but at the moment, it won't give you any information beyond
Yeah.
2021.
Yeah, the recent update of ChatGPT, prior to that, it was only pulling on things up to 2021, and now it's currently or will soon be basically drawing on more of the internet, and that's because Google Bard actually does draw on
Okay,
current
crash,
things as
yeah.
well. So, yeah, we were doing a workshop on it, rewriting it as we were having to rewrite the whole thing as we were going along. Just because, you know, it's changing so rapidly.
Mm.
And
So-
it's producing quite plausible references, as long as you
Up to
don't follow up on it.
And that point about rapid change, I think, is useful because maybe it speaks to the need to actually not just change the way we do things, but change the way that we change the way that we do things. In other words, more flexibility to redesign modules, to redesign assessment. And that's perhaps part of this broader point. One of the issues around these discourses is an equation of resistance with conservatism. Whereas actually what's interesting here is that there are upheavals, there are disruptions, and that in those disruptions, we might actually think about other things that we've wanted to change for a long time, and whether this might be the opportunity to advance those agendas. So a slightly separate point, I guess, is treating students as sci-fi cyborgs. Now, I do think students are cyborgs, but they're cyborgs in the kind of philosophical Donna Haraway sense, in that they, like all of us, are enmeshed in, constituted by technology, for example, these. But I think there's a danger of treating students as sci-fi cyborgs, in other words, imagining that they're always going to have access to these kinds of AI tools in every context in their lives. And that is what that is secretly doing, is it's privileging a certain type of context, which is basically office work. It's imagining that office work, when you're on your device and you have ChatGPT open in a tab, that's going to apply to everything in the student's life. If you're at a party and you want to know what to say next, it might not be that easy to kind of go on your phone and ask ChatGPT. So this is, I guess, part of that broader point about how education, not that I know how to be a good person, but that hopefully something in education is about shaping students to be, not just to perform certain tasks, let alone certain office-based tasks. So that's just kind of a summary, and I will circulate these slides. That's a summary of some of those issues with, I think, the framings of some of these conversations. And what I'd like to do now is move on in the last half hour or so and focus a bit more on assessment. We've raised these topics, and perhaps now we can drill down a little bit. So these are some prepositions connecting assessment and learning, assessment of learning, assessment for learning, assessment as learning, assessment without learning, assessment instead of learning. And obviously there are lots of different ways of breaking up assessment, but I just find this one quite useful. Assessment of learning, that's the one where you kind of put students in a hierarchy, and it has implications for employment, further study or research, professional certification, perhaps sense of self-worth and self-understanding. And this assessment of learning, it's seldom really assessment of additional learning. It always also reflects pre-existing distributions of privilege, of social culture and educational capital. So that's quite a down way of putting it, quite dismissive. And you know, I am quite annoyed by assessment of learning, but there are good cases to be made for it as well. You know, if it's something like kind of medical professional expertise, that it's important to be able to assess that somebody has learned up to a particular level. Assessment for learning, this is, you know, formative assessment. As educators learn about our individual students and can tailor our approach, what and how we teach, because we know what it is that they know. Assessment as learning. So each of these, I think, something like ChatGPT might impact in different ways and might create different affordances. Assessment as learning might involve witnessing the student's research as an engaged audience, being that engaged audience for the student that gives them the kind of motivation to create, to do something, raising the stakes so that the student might practice in a more intensive and focused kind of cognitive activity. giving students greater legitimacy to prioritize their learning. This is the crunch time. Here's your deadline. This is when you need to be, working in this way, rather than dealing with all these other competing priorities. Signaling that this is the moment, that we've covered all these other areas, and now is when everything's going to come together and you're going to consolidate it, and inviting students to learn how to learn. So assessment as learning, I don't know, that's where I feel most positive about assessment. We also might have assessment without learning. In other words, students figure out how to cope with the requirements without being altered in any way themselves, for example, without acquiring skills. And maybe an extreme version of that is assessment instead of learning. So all that energy that you pour into going online, looking at the tutorials for how to kind of hack the detection tools, et cetera, that's taking up time that otherwise might be used perhaps to learn the things that the assessment was supposed to teach, or to learn something else. And then there are other interesting aspects to assessment that we might want to think about. For example, sometimes assessment as learning, we might want to differentiate if the learning is, what is learned is false or harmful, or is perhaps disciplinary in some way. And assessment is, for better or for worse, a space of subjective discretionary judgment and interpersonal agency. In other words, it's a space where sometimes educators do things to and for students, whether or not they're supposed to, that's something that happens. I said, may make amends or take revenge, may reward or punish, may guess by feedback about a range of things, for example. From my experience, doing some creative writing marking, sometimes you would see a poem, and the poem is completely fictional, but you have a sense that it's about something in the student's life, and you might want to kind of sneak in a little bit of support and advice into your feedback that's not exactly about the poem. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about there. I think there's some better, let's take a moment then. So let's just open it up. If those are some of the aspects of assessment, how might ChatGPT influence them in different ways? And we're coming to the really good bit, so let's just take a minute or two over this. How do we think these different dimensions of assessment might be impacted differently by AI tools? Should we do it in groups again, briefly? Have a minute to chat about that? Okay, cool.
Pause it before we go.
So in this last part, I want to just look at some approaches to assessment. And I've described this approach. 0 is deflationary. In other words, I don't really care. I don't think that's any of us now. So I'll just kind of skip past that, actually, except that maybe there's a variation of this, which is important, which is I don't have time to care about this. I don't have an answer to that, but I thought it's worth flagging. So some approaches to AI and assessment. Ban it, make sure we know how to detect it. Again, I think we're probably maybe a little bit past that now. Allow AI and build assessments around it. Make it impossible to use AI by designing assessment that AI can't help with. Define appropriate uses of AI and detect inappropriate uses of AI. Create new forms of citation. Get students to assess themselves. These may overlap in practice. So let's skip past detection. We've covered this in some detail. I guess one thing that's kind of interesting maybe is that one approach to this is watermarking. So there are quite fun statistical ways of creating a text using a generative AI that can then be definitely traced back to that. Of course, you can simply run it through Quillbot or some other AI to scrape away the watermark. Maybe one other kind of thing that might be interesting about detection is thinking about how it might work as deterrence, recognizing that it's never going to be completely effective, but how might it kind of shape the affordances for students? How might it make them feel different about using different shortcuts, tools, etc.? I've put a hypothesis: the more transparent, just, and rational the assessment system is, the less likely you can rationalize gaming the system in any way. A partially successful deterrent system, one thing that we might want to think about is that actually the students who then end up benefiting from the AI are the ones who are going to go that extra mile to look up all the tutorials and do the detection avoidance, which I don't think would be a good thing. I put a link up there to Against Cop Shit by Jeffrey Morrow, which, yeah, just it kind of makes that point about maybe not treating our students as adversaries if possible. Integrating AI, generative AI into assessment. So there on the left, ignore the text on the right, which is the wrong text, but there on the left is an imaginary kind of assessment that you might be filling out some kind of form, and it takes you through the process step by step. And it maybe just makes it not worth it to try and use the AI to do all of this. It's actually simpler just to go with the flow of the assessment, step by step, involving using the AI in structured ways, saying what your prompts are, saying what the outputs are, saying when you went to the library to investigate sources and so on. And when I said option 8, a game, you could imagine a really fantastic, fun, engaging version of this start to become less like a bureaucratic form and more like a game, with milestones that you reach and objectives that you unlock and so on. So already we're getting into the territory of kind of prevention, designing activities that reduce the usefulness of AI, exams or exam-like activities, oral presentations, etc. It is interesting to think what might be lost if a lot of assessment very, very suddenly moved in this direction. Would there be worthwhile forms of assessment that are lost? And if so, can we maybe cultivate what was learned in them in other ways? And we've touched on authentic assessment and action research there already. And looking at some of my assessments, I actually think they are already fairly kind of resilient in some ways. The portfolio assessments that, as Sharon was talking about, kind of go episode by episode across a semester, and are not something that you kind of can swoop in week 11 and do in a big cram and rush. And then maybe there's an approach that kind of combines these things. So maybe good assessment design might involve making it hard to use the AI in certain ways, while also making it easy and rewarding to use it in other ways, and maybe some detection in there. So that's the question for us here. What do we think then of this? These approaches. In fact, maybe it's worth actually just very briefly touching on the final two. So ungrading, the one person who knows how much they've used the AI is the student themselves. Can we incorporate that knowledge? Can we build that in? So ungrading is an approach that centers self-evaluation. There's a lot of trust building in ungrading. And there are lots of versions of it. So sometimes the educator has a kind of right of veto that they actually in practice never need to use, but the fact that they have it kind of changes the way that students think about evaluating their own work. For me, I would love to use this. I haven't had the guts yet, and my one kind of reservation is that do students have expertise in their own expertise? I think I've had students who are shocked by how well they've done. And maybe sometimes the reverse is a problem as well, but especially that, students who would undervalue how well they are achieving. So the response might be that we include teaching students how to reflect on their own expertise. And then again, I wonder about what that might displace on my curriculum. Is that something that I have time to do while also delivering all the other stuff I want to do on a module? But it does fascinate me as an approach. So the Portsmouth approach, and not just the Portsmouth approach, but many institutions are saying that we should appropriately cite and reference any text or output generated by AI. So this is very interesting, but I think we had this point earlier. It's not like normal citation. You're not referring to a publicly available text that can be independently verified. You're referring to a text that appears once on your screen as the output of this vast probabilistic system. Will students do this? There is a long history of use of automation that involves bits of deception and often just kind of bits of exaggeration. So even when somebody does something incredibly impressive with AI, there seems to be a almost irresistible temptation to slightly exaggerate the level of achievement. I think that if we are going to have citing the AI be part of our approach, we need to think about new forms of citation. And that's really why I mentioned, like, would it be interesting if we had our own tools? So our own kind of text generating tools, if that process is perhaps tracked automatically in some way, or there's citation protocols that are kind of built into the writing tool. I don't know, maybe this is the far future, but yes.
Would like the Internet Archive, I wonder if you like scrape that URL at that time, you would save that response, or would it generate once you go back?
I don't think they scrape rapidly enough, but we can
Well, no,
we can find out.
you can go in and like create your own straight away, can't you?
Oh right, so you could just create an instance of that
Yeah.
and then cite that.
Yeah, I'm just wondering whether or not when you go back to that link it regenerates, or whether
Yeah.
it capture what's actually there.
I mean, it's the honesty is a loaded word, but I think is the psychology of it that's challenging. Yes.
I'm thinking there's we've got links on this page coming up to university student guidance. I think it's UCL that giving students guidance on how to cite AI, which it's not our policy, but it's useful to see examples of how to communicate that to students. The other thing that occurred to me was that if you are asking students to cite, and it would show you what it is that they've used as a basis, or what they asked ChatGPT, etc. And it comes back to your point about transparency and open and honesty. If they're not telling us what they're doing, and we're not building that conversation, they're going to learn about using these tools potentially faster than we are. So you're able to see that they use this, and also see that they've not done it particularly well. They haven't managed to improve on it. So you kind of have a better understanding in your feedback of, it's like saying, it's like commenting on how students have used the sources that they refer to in their texts. So you can see feedback on that side a bit more.
Well, I would do, in the long run, I think, like for English at least, portfolios, all of the stuff you were talking about, week to week, different tasks, things like that. In the short run, this is just a question. What happens if you said to ChatGPT, write me an 8,000 word dissertation on?
It won't write you an 8,000 word dissertation because it has a word limit. So
Right.
I mean, if you're just looking for tips on spotting things, literally, Pam, feel free to send me. I'm pretty good at spotting it in its current iteration.
Great.
One of the things that you'll see is that there's, if that's the approach you want to take, is that it will be very, very sutured. So they'll have done one prompt, and then they'll have done another prompt and they've tied together. And in one case, forgot to take out when they copy pasted the actual literal prompt itself, which is pretty funny.
Thanks.
What are the word limits, just out of curiosity?
I can't remember. Does
It's
anybody know?
500 words approximately. They do it by characters. You don't get much, but of course you can just keep adding and adding. But you suddenly get, I think, with my brief experience, I've just been playing around with it, you get a sudden change of style. You don't always get, you say, I put in, write a 2,000 word article. I kept hoping I'd slip through, get getting in the style of a first class degree student, and then I tried an upper second. It didn't recognise those terms at all. So then I'd say good or bad, an average, a good and a bad. But even if I kept saying average student, I think there would have been a detectable difference in style between the first thing it sent me and the next thing, because it's so random. I think it's detectable. I obviously not put it to the test.
At the very back, I skipped them because I wasn't sure how interesting they'd be, but at the very back of the slide deck, I've got some notes on what I think are ChatGPT's current style. If you're just interested in.
Can you not change the style though? You said, is there a ChatGPT style? Isn't it the style in what you ask it to do?
I mean, you can do
things in 4 different
Yeah,
styles,
you
and they were almost identical. I said, write an interesting article and write a boring article, and all it did to make an interesting article was add, which makes this a fascinating.
I guess that the words that you use, the call to action. So I've gotten very distinct, responses by introducing, say, Socratic,
Right.
yeah, or philosophical, or Shakespearean,
Yeah.
yeah, and it writes for you very distinctly. So I guess there are words that the AI definitely is able to recognize.
It might also.
Maybe interesting, boring, that's quite largely vague, yeah? So what might be interesting to you may not be interesting to
Yeah,
me.
but I also
But
did,
Socratic is.
can you write it in the Wall Street Journal style, can you write it, I did a few different ones, and they were pretty indistinguishable, but I think some of it might be the subject.
Yeah.
Because if you're writing about a subject that's mostly written about in academic prose, that's probably gonna feed into what you get back.
Aren't we also feeding into it by testing it?
Yeah.
Like, oh, this isn't interesting, this is
Yeah.
boring. So then it's gone, oh, okay, so.
It's like the
so-
board.
Yeah, it's a feedback. So it's like, okay, so that isn't interesting, I will remember that, and it's evolving.
Again, and I think that's really important because these questions are interesting, and they're especially interesting for the short term and, marking this term. But this is probably going to change. And one of the things that will probably happen is we already have it with Bard, a little bit more nuance in how you steal it stylistically. I do think that ChatGPT at the moment has a style of thinking which is actually consistent, even if you're getting it to write in Shakespearean prose. It still has this kind of bland upbeatness to everything it says. And it's just, well, interestingly.
Can you tell it to be cynically ironic or anything?
And the thing is, if you do, you'll get these very discrete markers of cynicism pasted on top of this basically kind of upbeat, well-structured voice.
Whatever.
A really interesting, yeah, exactly. A lot of this data, not a lot of this data set, but an important part of this data set was handcrafted by people writing responses to queries that were initially given to GPT-3. So yeah, perhaps I don't know who those writers were, but maybe.
I think they don't know who the writers were, but they certainly had testers where they asked people. The testers were outsourced to I can't remember somewhere where people weren't paid very much, but they were asked to sort of read responses and to agree whether this was correct.
Yeah.
So you've got ChatGPT and similar generating responses based on what's on the internet, which obviously we all know is very biased, very Western, very white. And then also you have people testing it who are and then imposing their own individual and cultural biases onto what is or isn't correct. It's much like how AI that decides on Twitter whether a chest being exposed is pornography or not, is actually biased against representations of women, for example. Do you know what I mean? So I think it's an interesting thing to talk to students about as well, of course. It's a really interesting thing about how knowledge is generated, perpetuated and reworked, in society, in our wonderful society.
In the further resources, I really like Kate Crawford's Atlas of AI, and talks about some of those things that you brought up there. Maybe not so much in terms of text generation, more in terms of, for example, image classification, but yeah, the same themes run throughout.
I just raised a little bit, some of the things that you suggested there were the kind of assessment that you want to do anyway.
Right.
But we've been inadvertently trained against it in some ways by the failures of the ethics system for undergraduate teaching and by reasonable adjustments and what we know is there. And that's where I think we need more joined up thinking about how are we going to make these things happen when we know that a quarter of the people in that class have tags that say they don't have to talk in front of anybody, things like that.